I built this moss wall bottle terrarium well over a year ago, and it is still thriving thanks to the steps I took when building it and in subsequent maintenance sessions. As it is now time for another trim and maintenance session, let's briefly go over some of the things I've learned in the past year to accompany that original video so that your moss wall builds can thrive for years to come. A link to that original build guide will be visible in the end screen of this video, so without further ado, let's get to it. As I mentioned in previous updates, the narrow and long neck of this style bottle, followed by the large flaring shoulders, so to speak, create a dead zone, where it is very difficult to fit even the curved scissors. I probably need to get those complete 90-degree bend scissors that some aquascapers use, but honestly, I'm not sure if those would work, and it seems rather unrealistic and unnatural to me to design this channel around beginner budget builds and then go out and buy a specific tool for one specific style of build. There was also an issue with the original sticks I added being far too thin and getting waterlogged from the humidity rather quickly. As a result, I did exchange them for significantly thicker sticks, which now a year or so later are still holding strong. In reality, if I kept this terrarium going for 5 or more years, I do expect that I'd have to eventually change them out, but that isn't really all that big of a deal to me. I have one terrarium I made a few years before this channel that was literally just a jar of dirt and some moss from outside, and the stick in there is thinner than these ones and is still pretty solid, albeit it has started to sag a bit by now from the humidity. The two sticks I put along the sides of this terrarium were really nice for the aesthetic of the original video and build, but honestly, as time has gone on, it is more and more difficult to keep them visible post-trimming, especially with the addition of the vining creeping fig. So the details of the grub scars and the likes are pretty much wasted at this point. When I recollect on the difficulty I've faced adhering them to the inside of the bottle in the correct orientation without smearing glue all over the place, it probably was not worth the effort in the long run. Similarly, the stones themselves are kinda hard to keep visible without frequent trimming sessions. This isn't really a problem in theory, but in practice, I do tend to let my nano builds like this go wild for a few months at a time, so I can just mass trim several at once and harvest that moss and the other plants from them to use in larger builds that rarely end up on this channel. The only real way around this is to trim more frequently, as the stone steps within the bottle are essentially the main point of this design. Next, when it comes to the oak leaf creeping fig itself, I've come to kind of despise this plant in small builds. It does take a while to establish, and it actually looks really nice when it first takes off and after trimming sessions, but it can quickly overgrow, and in these small scapes, it very quickly outgrows the moss. Additionally, because it roots through the moss and all along its stems, it's hard to remove it without removing a notable amount of moss and soil, which then needs to be put back. Otherwise, over time, the soil becomes thinner and thinner and thinner. There are very few vining plants with leaves this small, so I'm not really sure what else to use in its place. It's kind of like a necessary evil, in builds of this size if you want that type of look. It was a bit unidimensional without it, the original build that is, and with it, it requires much more frequent trimming. It does look really cool when it's trimmed frequently, don't get me wrong. It's just that I have way too many builds to keep up with in addition to real life. So if you only have a few builds, I would indeed recommend using it, but just be prepared for it to be a very fast growing plant for this scale once established. I'm pretty happy that the springtail colony is still alive and well. These little critters do self-regulate, and their feces is essentially the fertilizer that we use for these terrariums. Although some people do fertilize their terrariums, instead, what I do is when I do my trimmings, I put a grain or two of white rice in the container. They don't eat the rice directly, but as the rice quickly molds in these humid conditions, it helps make sure there is adequate food for the springtails to supplement their generic cleanup crew duties. It's also important to remember that whenever you do maintenance, you're removing water from the system, both through the mild air exchange that happens, assuming you don't live in the tropics, your house is probably much less humid than the terrarium itself, and through the removal of the plant matter. To combat this, conveniently, trimming is usually a messy job, so I just lightly spritz the terrarium with filtered water and then take an absorbent material like a bit of paper towel attached to the long tweezers to wipe down the glass. This removes some of the excess water from the spritzing and helps clean the glass of debris. The sticks and rocks definitely hinder my ability to do this, so it really is quite important to plan out your builds with their long-term maintenance in mind. Lastly, it is important to remember that plants grow towards the light. When planting and trimming your terrarium, you really need to know where the light is going to be coming from and at what intensity. This is easily correctable over time, and since I know you all paid attention in physics, I'm not going to extend this video by explaining the inverse square law.